EuroPro is an advanced professional program for those who want to move from knowing that EU funding exists to understanding how to access it, compete for it, manage it, and use it to create measurable European impact. In this introduction, you will see some of the key points from EuroPro main sessions. First, EU policies, stakeholders, funds. Second, lobbying, power and influence. Third, project design and AI proposal writing. Fourth, project management and teamwork. Fifth, adaptive leadership and resilience in EU projects. And practical work on EU projects. The purpose is not to memorize acronyms or admire Brussels from a safe distance. The purpose is to build professional capability, to identify the right opportunities, read calls intelligently, design competitive proposals, enter strong European consortia, manage funded projects, and lead people through complexity. EuroPro is therefore not only about EU funds. It is about developing the advanced European skills needed to turn policy priorities into projects, projects into results, and results into institutional, economic, and social impact. Let us begin with a useful truth. EU funding does not exist to reward pleasant ideas. It exists to implement European policy priorities through credible organizations, strong partnerships, and measurable results. This is one of the first disciplines of professional EU funding work. We do not begin by asking, what would I like to write? We begin by asking, what is the European Union trying to achieve? Through which program? Under which policy priority? With what expected outcomes? And with which type of consortium? A proposal is never just a document. It is the final expression of a chain: idea, policy relevance, program fit, call interpretation, consortium architecture, work plan, implementation capacity, and impact logic. If one part of that chain is weak, the evaluator will usually notice. Evaluators are inconvenient like that. In EuroPro, participants learn to transform ideas into fundable concepts. We analyze how EU priorities become programs, how programs become calls, how calls become evaluation criteria, and how evaluation criteria shape the proposal structure. This is where the professional discipline begins. The skill is not merely to write more beautifully. The skill is to understand what the call is really asking, what kind of change is expected, who must be involved, and how the applicant can credibly contribute. When participants master this logic, they are no longer simply reacting to calls. They are building a funding strategy. They can move from an idea to a partnership, from a partnership to a proposal, and from a proposal to a project that can actually deliver impact. The first serious question in EU funding is not where is the application form, it is who shapes the opportunity. EU funding is influenced by politicians, commission services, executive agencies, EU delegations, national authorities, program committees, expert groups, applicants, beneficiaries, stakeholders, and end users. The applicant is part of the system, but not the center of the universe. This can be a painful discovery, but it is also the beginning of professional maturity. EU funding decisions emerge from policy priorities, institutional mandates, political compromise, evidence, consultation, operational needs, and budgetary constraints. Therefore, a strong applicant must understand the ecosystem around the call. Who defined the priority? Who manages the program? Who evaluates? Who benefits? Who has credibility in the field? Who has already been funded? Who can strengthen the consortium? Who can quietly block progress if ignored? In EuroPro, we train participants to map this decision environment. They learn to identify the formal and informal actors behind funding opportunities, the difference between program management and project evaluation, and the importance of stakeholders in shaping relevance and impact. This knowledge becomes a practical skill. Participants learn to design proposals that speak not only to their own organizational interests, but to the needs of the funding system. That means stronger relevance, clearer positioning, and more credible impact pathways. The real-world impact is that participants stop behaving like isolated applicants. They learn to act as strategic participants in a European policy and funding ecosystem. EU funding exists because policy needs implementation. That is the core principle. Politics defines the direction. EU priorities organize that direction. Policies explain what should change. Legislation gives legal and regulatory force. Funding programs allocate resources. Work programs refine objectives. Calls invite applicants to contribute. Projects deliver outputs, outcomes, and impact. This is why a serious EU proposal must be policy literate. It is not enough to say that your project is useful. Useful to whom? Under which policy priority? Against which problem? With what measurable contribution? In relation to which expected outcome? This logic is very close to public policy implementation theory. Policies do not implement themselves. They require instruments, organizations, resources, partnerships, incentives, and monitoring. EU projects are one of the instruments through which policy becomes practice. In EuroPro, participants learn to reverse engineer the funding chain. Starting from a call, they trace it back to work programs, policy priorities, regulations, strategies, and political objectives. Then they move forward again, translating that logic into objectives, work packages, partner roles, deliverables, and impacts. The skill created here is extremely valuable. Participants become able to explain why a project belongs under a specific call, why it matters now, and how it contributes to European added value. This is also where many weak proposals fail. They describe activities without proving policy relevance. They present effort without demonstrating strategic contribution. In plain language, they look busy, but not important. EuroPro teaches participants to avoid that trap. EU funding starts with policy. Politicians, influence groups, and EU institutions define priorities. The European Commission then translates those priorities into funding programs, work programs, and calls. Applicants respond with projects, beneficiaries implement them, and the results should create measurable impact. So the rule is simple. A successful proposal is not built around what we would like to do, but around what EU policy needs to achieve. The multi-annual financial framework is the European Union's 7-year budgetary architecture. It is not just a financial table, it is a political statement about what the Union is willing to fund, at what scale, and for what long-term priorities. The 2021-2027 framework shapes the current generation of EU programs: Horizon Europe, Erasmus+, LIFE, Digital Europe, Creative Europe, external action instruments, and cohesion-related funds all operate within this broader financial architecture. Why does this matter to participants? Because EU funding is cyclical and strategic. Professionals who understand only the next deadline remain reactive. Professionals who understand the programming cycle can build pipelines, anticipate future calls, prepare partnerships early, and position organizations before the competition wakes up. In EuroPro, participants learn to think beyond individual calls. We examine how annual work programs sit inside multi-annual priorities, how budget lines signal political direction, and how organizations can develop funding strategies over several years. This becomes a practical planning skill. Participants can identify which themes are likely to continue, which priorities are growing, where new policy windows may open, and how their organization should prepare. The real impact is institutional readiness. Instead of chasing opportunities at the last minute, participants can help their organizations build long-term EU funding strategies. That means better timing, stronger partnerships, and far fewer heroic all-night proposal writing disasters. Entertaining in retrospect, perhaps, but not recommended as a business model. One of the quickest ways to fail in EU funding is to treat all EU funds as if they work in the same way. They do not. There are three broad funding logics participants must understand. Community action programs are managed centrally by the European Commission or executive agencies. These include Horizon Europe, Erasmus+, LIFE, Digital Europe, Creative Europe, Single Market Programme, and many others present on the next slide. External cooperation instruments follow neighbourhood, enlargement, development, and diplomatic priorities. They often involve EU delegations, partner countries, and external action logic. Structural, cohesion, and investment funds operate differently again. They are managed through national or regional systems and are linked to territorial development, infrastructure, competitiveness, employment, institutional capacity, and cohesion. Each logic has different rules, different evaluators, different partnership expectations, different language, and different evidence requirements. A Horizon Europe research and innovation action is not an IPA institutional capacity building project. An Erasmus Plus partnership is not an EIC accelerator investment case. These differences are not administrative decoration. They define how the proposal must be designed. In EuroPro, participants learn to classify funding instruments correctly and match project ideas to the right program logic. This is a core professional skill. It saves time, increases relevance, and prevents the very common tragedy of writing a reasonable project for the wrong fund. The impact is better strategic selection. Participants become able to advise organizations not only on how to apply, but whether to apply, where to apply, and how to adapt the concept to the right funding culture. EU funding programs can be understood in three main groups. First, structural, cohesion, and investment funds, mostly managed through national or regional authorities. Second, community action programs, managed directly by the European Commission and its agencies, such as Horizon Europe, Erasmus+, LIFE, Digital Europe, and Creative Europe. Third, external cooperation programs, used for enlargement, neighbourhood, development, and international cooperation. That is why it is critical to understand the specific regulations, procedures, eligibility rules, cost rules, and implementation obligations of each program. Only then can we design an adequate project proposal, build the right partnership, prepare a realistic budget, and implement the project according to the rules. Professional EU funding work requires evidence. Rumours, friendly advice, and someone told me there is a call are not an intelligence system. Participants need to know how to use the tools that reveal the funding landscape. The Funding and Tenders portal helps identify calls, conditions, deadlines, admissibility rules, eligibility rules, submission documents, and partner search functions. Cordis helps analyze funded projects, coordinators, partners, results, and state of the art. The financial transparency system helps follow EU funding flows and identify beneficiaries. EU Who is Who helps understand institutional actors. Program guides and work programs provide the official logic behind opportunities. In EuroPro, participants learn to use these tools not as passive databases, but as intelligence instruments. We use them to identify suitable calls, compare funded models, map strong coordinators, detect recurring partners, understand what has already been funded, and identify gaps where a new proposal can be positioned. This transforms research into competitive advantage. If you know who has already been funded, what they delivered, which consortia dominate the field, and which policy gaps remain, you are no longer guessing. You are designing from evidence. The impact is professional autonomy. Participants should be able to conduct their own EU funding intelligence, prepare stronger partner profiles, benchmark project ideas, and advise organizations with confidence. This is the difference between saying there may be opportunities somewhere and saying here is the call, here is the policy logic, here are comparable projects, here are potential coordinators, and here is our credible entry point. One sounds hopeful, the other sounds employable. Horizon Europe is presented as the central research and innovation program, with a budget of €95.5 billion for 2021-2027. Its logic is not charity, nor regional sympathy, nor support for nice initiatives. It funds excellence, innovation, competitiveness, societal challenges, and policy implementation. In EuroPro, participants learn how to read Horizon Europe as a system. We examine pillars, clusters, destinations, expected outcomes, topic scopes, project types, evaluation criteria, and consortium expectations. The skill is to determine where an idea truly belongs. This is not always where the applicant wishes it belonged. Horizon Europe is not impressed by wishful thinking. It is impressed by excellence, impact, and implementation capacity. The impact is better opportunity selection and stronger proposal design. Participants become able to identify realistic horizon pathways, understand evaluator logic, and position organizations in projects where they can genuinely add European value. Call analysis is the bridge between opportunity and proposal. The correct method is to read the call text, extract expected outcomes, identify key words and phrases, translate them into objectives, build a work breakdown structure, define partner roles, and write for evaluators. A call is not an invitation to improvise. It is a coded instruction manual. Not every organization should begin by coordinating. This is not an insult. It is a strategy. Coordination requires credibility, administrative capacity, financial reliability, subject authority, network strength, and the ability to manage risk. Many organizations, especially newcomers or smaller institutions, enter European projects more successfully through targeted roles: pilot site, data provider, stakeholder representative, dissemination partner, exploitation partner, technical expert, work package contributor, or user community. In EuroPro, participants learn how to position organizations intelligently within consortia. We work on partner profiles, role definition, added value, coordinator communication, evidence of capacity, and strategic networking. The key question is, what can this organization contribute that the consortium genuinely needs? Not what title does it want, not how important does it wish to appear. What can it credibly deliver? This is where many applicants go wrong. They present long institutional descriptions, but fail to explain their useful function in the project. Experienced coordinators are not looking for poetry. They are looking for capacity, complementarity, credibility, and reliable delivery. The impact is improved access to European partnerships. Participants learn how to enter consortia through realistic value propositions, build trust, gain experience, and gradually move towards stronger leadership roles. In EU projects, the first objective is often not to look important. It is to become useful. Importance can follow. Sometimes. The session closes with stakeholder analysis. Serious EU project development requires mapping relevant projects, organizations, coordinators, networks, publications, markets, and decision points. The professional instruction is simple. Follow the policy, follow the money, follow the results, follow the networks. That is how an idea becomes a fundable role. Let's introduce the second session on lobbying power and influence, where we move behind the polite surface of EU funding and examine how decisions actually move. EU programs do not appear by magic. They are created through political priorities, institutional processes, stakeholder pressure, evidence, expert groups, negotiations, compromises, and influence. In other words, the EU funding system is not only a legal and administrative structure, it is also a power environment. For professionals working with EU funds, this is critical. If you understand only the published call, you arrive late. If you understand the policy process behind the call, the actors involved, the timing of influence, and the logic of institutional compromise, you begin to work strategically. Lobbying, in the serious sense, is not manipulation. It is the disciplined representation of interests, evidence, and solutions to decision makers. Good lobbying helps institutions understand reality. Bad lobbying distorts it, and then we all pretend to be surprised when bad policy follows bad information. In EuroPro, we treat lobbying as part of professional EU project leadership. Participants learn to understand decision-making structures, distinguish power from authority, map stakeholders, identify influence channels, communicate evidence, build alliances, and position organizations responsibly. The practical skill is political intelligence, not party politics, not noise, not theatrical outrage, but the ability to understand who decides, who influences, who blocks, who benefits, and how a professional can act ethically inside that system. The impact is clear: stronger positioning, better partnerships, earlier strategic action, and more credible participation in EU policy and funding environments. The EU is complex because it combines supranational and intergovernmental elements. It has many decision-making processes, many actors, multiple levels, and differentiated speeds of integration. Anyone who claims this is simple has either never worked with it or is selling a training course with 3 slides and a certificate. EuroPro develops this skill through decision system mapping. Participants learn to analyze institutional levels, identify relevant actors, understand different decision pathways, and recognize where influence is possible. The impact is practical navigation. Participants become better able to avoid naive assumptions, target communication more effectively, build appropriate alliances, and understand why a proposal or policy initiative succeeds or fails in the real institutional environment. To understand EU influence, we need to understand different policy processes. The first is the community method. Here, the European Commission usually takes the policy initiative, the Council represents member states, and the European Parliament exercises legislative power, often through co-decision. This is the classic EU institutional triangle. The second is intergovernmental cooperation. This is used in sensitive areas where national sovereignty remains strong, such as foreign policy, defence, and justice. Here, member states have greater control, and the Commission's role may be more limited. The third is the open method of coordination. This is softer. It relies on benchmarking, peer review, indicators, national reform processes, and voluntary alignment. It does not always create binding law, but it can still shape national policies and funding priorities. A fourth pattern is central regulation, where specialized EU institutions or authorities exercise strong technical or regulatory power, for example in competition policy, monetary policy, or certain regulatory domains. The key characteristic of EU policymaking is compromise. Institutions anticipate one another, negotiate, adjust, and search for workable majorities. This is why EU calls often contain carefully balanced language, ambitious enough to signal policy intent, broad enough to survive institutional reality. The 2024-2029 strategic agenda frames the policy environment: democracy, fundamental rights, security, defense, enlargement, competitiveness, green and digital transitions, innovation, and social cohesion. Project positioning must speak this language. If the proposal sounds detached from EU priorities, it may be elegant, but elegance is not an evaluation criterion. The Commission's priorities translate political direction into institutional focus. They guide policy development, work programs, regulatory initiatives, funding instruments, and communication narratives. The major themes include sustainable prosperity and competitiveness, defense and security, quality of life, democracy and values, global partnerships, and a more effective future-ready union. These priorities are not slogans to paste into a proposal at the last minute. That is not alignment, that is cosmetic surgery. The professional task is to understand how organizational interests can be framed as contributions to wider European objectives. If your organization works on digitalization, how does that connect to competitiveness, security, public services, or innovation? If it works on education, how does that connect to skills, inclusion, employability, or democratic resilience? If it works on environment, how does it support transition, adaptation, or quality of life? In EuroPro, participants learn to translate expertise into policy-relevant language. They work with Commission priorities, work program texts, and call objectives to build arguments that are credible, specific, and evaluator-friendly. The skill is policy translation. Participants learn to move from "we do good work" to "our work contributes to this EU priority through these outcomes for these target groups with these measurable effects." The impact is stronger lobbying, communication, and proposal writing. Participants become capable of presenting their organization not as an isolated applicant asking for money, but as a credible contributor to European priorities. That is a very different conversation. Power, influence, and authority are often confused. They should not be. Power is the ability to affect outcomes. Influence is power in action. Authority is power recognized as legitimate. A person may have formal authority and very little influence. Another may have no formal title but control information, networks, access, timing, or credibility. French and Raven's classic theory of power is useful here. Legitimate power, expert power, reward power, coercive power, and referent power all shape behavior. Later organizational theorists, such as Jeffrey Pfeffer and Henry Mintzberg, remind us that power is often embedded in resources, uncertainty, information, networks, and strategic position. In EU projects and policy environments, the visible hierarchy is only part of the story. The organogram tells us who holds a title. It does not always tell us who knows the dossier, who can mobilize partners, who speaks to the Commission, who controls the budget, who shapes the narrative, or who quietly prevents things from moving. EuroPro develops power diagnostics. Participants learn to map formal authority, informal influence, expertise, access, legitimacy, and blocking capacity. The practical skill is strategic awareness. Participants become better able to understand consortium politics, stakeholder behavior, institutional priorities, and negotiation dynamics. The impact is improved leadership. Participants can engage the right people, build credibility, manage resistance, and avoid wasting energy persuading those who cannot decide or ignoring those who quietly can. In EU work, power is often subtle. Subtle does not mean weak. There are two major sources of power professionals need to understand: personal power and positional power. Personal power comes from who you are and how you behave. Expertise, effort, legitimacy, credibility, communication style, judgment, strategic vision, and the ability to build trust. If people believe you know what you are doing, deliver what you promise, and act with integrity, your influence increases. Positional power comes from where you sit in the system: centrality, visibility, flexibility, relevance, access to decision makers, control of resources, and sometimes the ability to block action. In networked systems, people at the center of information flows often have more influence than people with impressive titles but weak connections. For EU project professionals, both matter. Expertise without visibility may remain unused. Visibility without expertise becomes performance theatre. And performance theatre may attract attention, but it rarely survives serious evaluation. EuroPro trains participants to build ethical personal and positional power. They learn to strengthen expertise, increase credibility, communicate with precision, position themselves in relevant networks, negotiate roles, and become useful to decision makers and coordinators. The practical skill is influence building. Participants learn how to become trusted actors in EU projects and funding ecosystems. The impact is professional advancement. Participants can become stronger partners, more credible work package leaders, better coordinators, and more strategic institutional representatives. The aim is not to dominate the room. The aim is to become the person whose contribution improves the result. The session introduces influence tactics, rational persuasion, exchange, consultation, coalitions, upward appeals, legitimacy, inspirational appeal, ingratiation, and pressure. These tools are neither good nor bad by themselves. Their ethical quality depends on truthfulness, purpose, and proportionality. The darker side of lobbying includes distorted information, unequal access, lack of transparency, and campaigns that do not reflect genuine concerns. Ethical lobbying is not manipulation. It is the disciplined representation of real interests through evidence, credibility, and long-term positioning. In other words, influence, but with a spine. In the third session, Project Design and AI Proposal Writing, we enter the real workshop of serious EU proposal development. Many people think proposal writing means sitting down, opening the template, and beginning to type. That is usually how bad proposals are born. A strong EU proposal is not typed into existence. It is designed. It is built from policy logic, relevant data and evidence, stakeholder needs, consortium capacity, intervention design, implementation realism, and impact thinking. In EuroPro, we bring together several disciplines that must work together: cultural intelligence, communication, conflict management, scenario planning, proposal logic, and AI-supported drafting. These are not separate decorative modules. They are the skills that allow a professional to design a proposal that can survive evaluation, implementation, and reality. AI is part of this session, but let us be precise. AI is not a substitute for expertise. It is a multiplier of expertise. If the human expert understands the call, the policy context, the state of the art, the impact pathway, and the evaluator's expectations, AI can accelerate drafting, structure options, test consistency, and improve quality control. If the human expert does not understand these things, AI simply produces confident nonsense at industrial speed. Impressive, perhaps, but not fundable. In the live EuroPro program, participants work with real call texts, proposal sections, project logic, and AI-supported quality control exercises. They learn how to move from a broad idea to a structured project concept, how to manage inputs for AI tools, and how to verify whether the output is accurate, relevant, and evaluator ready. The impact is practical. Participants become able to design stronger project concepts, coordinate proposal development more intelligently, use AI without surrendering judgment, and produce proposals that are clearer, more coherent, and more competitive. The real skill is not using AI. The real skill is knowing what quality looks like before asking AI to help you produce it. EU projects are built across borders, institutions, disciplines, and professional cultures. That means culture is not a soft issue, it is a delivery issue. Geert Hofstede described culture as the collective programming of the mind. It shapes how people think, feel, communicate, decide, trust, disagree, and respond to uncertainty. Edward T. Hall also showed how communication differs between high context and low context cultures, where meaning may be carried explicitly through words or implicitly through context, relationships, and signals. In practice, this matters enormously. Some partners expect direct communication. Others read directness as aggression. Some expect hierarchy. Others expect open debate. Some see deadlines as sacred, others see them as negotiable indicators of intention. The comedy writes itself, although the project officer may not be laughing. Culture works like an iceberg. Above the surface, we see language, symbols, dress, formal behavior, and meeting style. Below the surface, we find assumptions, values, norms, rituals, status expectations, time orientation, and attitudes towards uncertainty. Most problems in international projects happen below the surface, while everyone politely discusses the agenda above it. In EuroPro, participants learn to diagnose cultural patterns without stereotyping. The aim is not to reduce countries or organizations to cliches. The aim is to recognize differences, ask better questions, design clearer communication, and prevent misunderstanding before it becomes conflict. The skill developed here is intercultural project intelligence. Participants learn to communicate across borders, adapt leadership style, clarify assumptions, build trust, and manage differences in expectations. The impact is stronger cooperation. Participants become better able to lead international consortia, facilitate cross-cultural meetings, interpret silence, disagreement, or delay more intelligently, and create working conditions where cultural difference becomes a resource rather than a constant source of irritation. Culture is the water in which the goldfish swims. EuroPro teaches participants to notice the water. The session examines 5 cultural dimensions. Power distance concerns the acceptance of inequality. Individualism concerns whether people act as autonomous individuals or members of groups. Masculinity relates to achievement versus quality of life. Uncertainty avoidance concerns comfort with ambiguity. Long-term orientation concerns pragmatic future orientation versus short-term certainty. These dimensions directly affect EU consortium work: hierarchy, meetings, deadlines, conflict, trust, and risk. Communication is one of the most underestimated success factors in EU projects. The basic model looks simple: sender, encoding, message, receiving, decoding, and meaning. The problem is that what the sender intends is not always what the receiver understands. Between intention and interpretation lies a dangerous little gap. Many projects fall into it, while everyone insists they were perfectly clear. Communication theory, from Shannon and Weaver onwards, reminds us that messages are affected by noise, channels, context, perception, and feedback. In project environments, the noise is not only technical, it is cultural, emotional, institutional, and political. Face-to-face communication is also shaped by words, tone, and body language. The exact percentages are debated and often oversimplified in popular training, but the underlying point is valid. People interpret the whole signal. If your words say, "I fully support this decision," while your tone, face, and follow-up behavior say, "I am preparing sabotage with a polite smile," people will usually believe the second message. In EuroPro, participants practice communication as a management skill. They learn to clarify intention, adapt messages to audiences, confirm understanding, use feedback loops, and recognize when communication has failed before it becomes a project problem. The skill is not only to speak well, it is to make meaning travel accurately across cultures, institutions, and roles. The impact is practical and immediate. Participants become better able to lead meetings, brief partners, explain proposal logic, communicate with stakeholders, negotiate responsibilities, and prevent misunderstandings. Good communication does not make every problem disappear, but poor communication can create problems that did not need to exist. And frankly, EU projects already have enough complexity without importing extra confusion for free. Active listening means observing, suspending judgment, asking open questions, clarifying, paraphrasing, summarizing, and checking assumptions. Sending skills require clarity, one thought per sentence, direct requests, and alignment between words and non-verbal signals. Responding skills require staying in adult mode, separating people from opinions, and resisting manipulation traps. Influence in EU projects operates at multiple levels. At the interpersonal level, influence includes rational persuasion, consultation, and collaboration. This is the familiar world of conversation, evidence, negotiation, and relationship building. At the structural level, influence appears through agenda setting, gatekeeping, and framing. Whoever defines the agenda often shapes the decision before the meeting begins. This is why just one small point under any other business is sometimes where ambition goes to die. At the network level, influence comes from alliances, reputation capital, trusted relationships, and access. In EU projects, networks matter because credibility often travels through people before it appears in documents. At the strategic level, influence includes soft power, regulatory shaping, and policy entrepreneurship. Professor Joseph Nye's concept of soft power is useful here. Influence can come from attraction, credibility, values, and agenda setting, rather than force. At the executive level, influence comes from mandate, authority, implementation power, and control of resources. Then there are dark or manipulative tactics: coercion, astroturfing, patronage, distortion, and manufactured consensus. We study these not to admire them, but to recognize them. One studies disease to avoid becoming infected. In EuroPro, participants learn to diagnose which influence level is operating and how to respond ethically. They learn to build alliances, shape narratives, protect credibility, and avoid manipulation. The skill is influence literacy. Participants become able to understand how decisions are shaped and how to act responsibly inside complex systems. The impact is stronger advocacy, better stakeholder engagement, and more effective consortium leadership. Influence is not a dirty word. Misused influence is the problem. Ethical influence is how serious professionals build better decisions. Conflict is normal in EU projects. If there is no conflict at all, it may mean nobody understands the project yet, nobody cares enough, or everyone is saving their objections for later, which is always generous. Conflict is a resource to be used. Conflict occurs when one party believes its goals, needs, or interests are blocked by another. It may appear to be about budget, deadlines, deliverables, or wording. Beneath the surface, it is often about power, values, identity, risk, status, trust, or control. The Thomas Kilmann model helps us understand conflict styles: avoiding, accommodating, competing, compromising, and collaborating. Fisher and Urey's principled negotiation teaches us to separate the people from the problem, focus on interests rather than positions, generate options, and use objective criteria. In EuroPro, participants learn to diagnose conflict before reacting. The skill is negotiation maturity. Participants learn how to clarify positions, reveal interests, manage emotions, protect relationships, and still move towards decisions. The impact is improved consortium resilience. Participants can manage partner disagreements, negotiate roles, prevent escalation, facilitate compromise, and turn conflict into learning. The objective is not to eliminate conflict. Conflict often reveals what matters. The objective is to make conflict useful. Scenario planning is the discipline of thinking intelligently about uncertainty. It does not predict the future. That is fortune telling, and the EU does not usually fund fortune telling unless it is rebranded as foresight with enough methodology. Good scenario planning explores plausible alternative futures, identifies driving forces, challenges assumptions, and prepares strategic responses. The process assesses the current situation, gathers data, identifies driving forces, generates alternative scenarios, assesses implications, and defines strategy. The skill is strategic foresight. Participants learn to design projects that are more resilient, more adaptive, and more aware of uncertainty. The impact is stronger planning. Participants can anticipate risks, identify opportunities, prepare alternatives, and avoid rigid strategies that collapse when reality behaves rudely. Good scenarios challenge assumptions. Bad scenarios are just optimism and pessimism wearing business clothes. The session dives deep into three project design logics. IPA3 often follows log frame logic: relevance, feasibility, policy alignment, objectives, results, assumptions, and indicators. Horizon Europe REI follows evaluator logic: excellence, impact, and implementation. EIC Accelerator follows investor logic: breakthrough innovation, market opportunity, scale, risk, business model, and team capacity. AI can support proposal writing, but it must be controlled. The first principle is simple: data in, logic on, quality out. If the input is weak, the output will be weak. If the call analysis is poor, AI will not rescue it. It may simply make the weakness sound more fluent, which is perhaps worse, because now the mistake has confidence. A serious AI-supported proposal system begins by identifying key variables: policy context, work program objectives, call text, eligibility conditions, evaluation criteria, state of the art, impact potential, stakeholder needs, and implementation capacity. Then we build credible dataset: EU policies, program documents, call texts, Cordis projects, scientific literature, market reports, stakeholder evidence, regulations, standards, and previous evaluation learning. Then we apply quality control. In EuroPro, participants practice AI-supported drafting and review. They learn to use AI for structuring, gap analysis, consistency checking, alternative formulations, and evaluator-style critique. But the final judgment remains human. The skill is controlled augmentation. Participants learn to use AI to improve speed and quality without surrendering intellectual responsibility. The impact is a stronger and faster proposal development. Participants can produce better drafts, identify weaknesses earlier, reduce inconsistency, and improve alignment with evaluation criteria. AI should not hallucinate into the void. It should work inside guardrails, and the expert must build those guardrails. In the fourth session, Project Management and Teamwork, we move from winning the grant to delivering the promise. This is where many organizations discover a painful truth. A funded proposal is not a trophy. It is a contract with reality. And reality, unlike the proposal template, does not always follow headings, page limits, and polite assumptions. Project management is the discipline that turns an approved idea into implemented work, delivered outputs, measurable outcomes, and credible impact. In EU-funded projects, this includes planning, coordination, governance, team management, reporting, risk control, stakeholder engagement, financial discipline, and performance measurement. The European Commission's PM² methodology, together with broader traditions from PMI, ISO, and systems-based project management, gives us a structured way to manage complexity. But methodology alone is not enough. Projects are delivered by people, and people are wonderfully talented at misunderstanding instructions, protecting their interests, and waiting until the last moment to mention that something has gone wrong. In EuroPro, participants learn to treat implementation as a professional discipline. We move from proposal promises to operational structures: work packages, deliverables, responsibilities, timelines, risk registers, indicators, reporting routines, and management dashboards. The skill is implementation intelligence. Participants learn how to organize work, lead teams, monitor progress, correct deviations, and protect the project's purpose. The impact is practical and institutional. Participants become better able to manage funded projects responsibly, reduce implementation failure, improve partner coordination, deliver outputs on time, and demonstrate results that funders, stakeholders, and citizens can actually recognize. Winning a grant creates opportunity. Managing it well creates credibility. And credibility is what allows organizations to win again. A project is a temporary organizational structure created to deliver a unique output under constraints. It has a beginning, an end, objectives, scope, complexity, resources, and limits of time, cost, and quality. That sounds simple. It is not. The moment we define something as a project, we accept responsibility for scope, coordination, risk, resources, stakeholders, and results. We also accept that the project is not simply work as usual. It is a temporary system built to achieve a defined change. Projects are not permanent departments, routine operations, or vague intentions with a logo. In EU-funded projects, the funder expects more than activity. The project must deliver agreed outputs, produce outcomes, and contribute to impact. It must also be documented, justified, and reported. In EuroPro, participants learn to define projects correctly. They clarify scope, objectives, deliverables, roles, resources, constraints, and assumptions. They learn to identify what is inside the project and what is outside it. This is important because if everything is included, nothing is manageable. The skill is project management. Participants become able to formulate clear project boundaries, define success criteria, and structure work in a way that can be planned and monitored. The impact is fewer chaotic implementations. Participants will be able to prevent scope creep, improve accountability, reduce confusion, and communicate project purpose more clearly to teams and stakeholders. A project without a clear scope is not flexible. It is simply waiting to become a crisis, with minutes of the meeting attached. One of the most important distinctions in EU project management is the difference between outputs, outcomes, and impact. Outputs are what the project produces: reports, tools, training sessions, platforms, pilots, methodologies, policy briefs, prototypes, events, databases, or services. Outcomes are the changes that occur because those outputs are used. Impact is the broader, measurable improvement that follows over time. This distinction is central to results-based management, intervention logic, and evaluation practice. The OECD evaluation criteria, European Commission intervention logic, and modern program evaluation all emphasize that projects must be assessed not only by what they deliver, but by what changes as a result. A deliverable that exists but changes nothing is administratively alive and strategically dead. It may sit beautifully in a project repository, it may even have a reference number, but if nobody uses it, learns from it, applies it, or benefits from it, the impact is mostly decorative. In EuroPro, participants learn to build a results chain. They learn to connect deliverables to stakeholder use, indicators, benefits, and policy contribution. The skill is impact logic. Participants become able to explain why project activities matter, how outputs will be used, what behavioral or institutional change is expected, and how benefits can be measured. The real-world impact is stronger proposal design, stronger implementation, and stronger reporting. Participants can produce projects that do not merely complete tasks, but create value. Evaluators and project officers are not deeply moved by a deliverable simply existing. They want to know what changed because it existed. Quite demanding, yes, but also rather reasonable. Project management follows a life cycle because complex work needs structure. The PM squared lifecycle moves through initiation, planning, execution, monitoring and control, and closing. Each phase has a purpose. Initiation clarifies why the project should exist. Planning defines how it will be delivered. Execution performs the work. Monitoring and control compare reality with the plan. Closing captures results, lessons, and accountability. The life cycle protects the project from two common dangers. The first is endless preparation without action. The second is enthusiastic action without preparation. Both are popular. Neither is particularly professional. In EU-funded projects, life cycle discipline matters because implementation is monitored by funders, partners, and stakeholders. Progress must be documented. Deliverables must be submitted. Risks must be managed. Changes must be justified. Results must be reported. In EuroPro, participants learn how to manage real EU projects. They define governance structures, plan activities, assign responsibilities, set milestones, monitor deviations, manage risks, and close projects properly. The skill is project management. Participants become able to understand where the project is in its life cycle, what decisions are required, what documents should exist, and what management actions are appropriate. The impact is better control and better delivery. Participants can reduce confusion, improve coordination, detect problems earlier, and ensure that project activities remain aligned with objectives. Planning budgets is useful. Persuading humans to behave like a coordinated team is sometimes the more advanced science. PM squared gives us the structure. Leadership makes the structure work. Project managers must understand strategy because projects operate inside changing organizations. Functional structures, matrix structures, and dedicated project teams each have strengths and weaknesses. The correct structure balances the needs of the project with the needs of stakeholders. The wrong structure produces a magnificent reporting system for a project that no one can actually deliver. Organizational culture is the set of shared assumptions, norms, values, behaviors, and unwritten rules that shape how people actually work. Edgar Schein's work is essential here. Culture is not what organizations write in their strategy documents. It is what people do when nobody is checking the strategy document. It determines how decisions are made, how bad news is handled, how conflict is expressed, how responsibility is accepted, and how innovation is treated. In project management, culture can support or destroy implementation. A culture of openness helps teams identify risks early. A culture of blame hides problems until they become disasters. A culture of collaboration strengthens work package delivery. A culture of internal competition turns coordination into theatre. EU projects are especially sensitive to culture because they involve multiple organizations. Each partner brings its own habits, incentives, decision rules, and internal politics. The consortium agreement may define formal roles, but culture shapes how those roles are actually performed. In EuroPro, participants learn to read organizational culture as a management variable. They examine visible behaviors, informal rules, communication patterns, decision habits, and resistance signals. The skill is cross-cultural project leadership. Participants become able to adapt communication, build trust, handle resistance, and design management processes that fit the real environment. The impact is better delivery and fewer invisible failures. Participants can identify cultural barriers early, manage expectations, and prevent informal resistance from quietly destroying formal plans. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, as Peter Drucker is often credited with saying. In EU projects, it also snacks on work packages by lunch if the project manager is not paying attention. The work breakdown structure, or WBS, is one of the most important tools in project planning. The WBS breaks the project down from overall aim to objectives, components, work packages, tasks, and responsibilities. It transforms ambition into organized work. Without it, the project remains a cloud of good intentions. A serious work package should have a clear purpose, description, activities, deliverables, duration, resources, budget, indicators, risks, and responsible partner. This is not bureaucracy. It is the management architecture that allows the team to know who does what, when, with which resources, and to what standard. In EU proposals, the WBS also communicates credibility to evaluators. It shows whether the consortium understands the work, whether tasks are logically sequenced, whether partners have meaningful roles, and whether the budget corresponds to the work plan. In EuroPro, participants learn to design WBS structures from real project concepts. They break objectives into work packages, define activities, identify dependencies, assign responsibilities, and connect deliverables to outcomes. The skill is operational design. Participants become able to create work plans that are not only persuasive in the proposal, but usable during implementation. The impact is clarity, accountability, and control. Participants can reduce duplication, identify missing tasks, allocate resources more realistically, and monitor progress more effectively. A project without a WBS is not agile, it is merely vague, and vagueness rarely survives contact with auditors, evaluators, or reality. In EuroPro, participants examine and train on real WP structures from funded or fundable project models. They learn how to connect WPs to objectives, how to distribute partner roles, how to avoid overloaded or empty WPs, and how to design activities that evaluators can trust. The skill is work plan architecture. Participants become able to create project structures that are logical, balanced, and implementable. The impact is stronger proposals and smoother execution. A well-designed work package structure helps the consortium understand the project, helps the evaluator trust it, and helps the coordinator manage it. If it is not in the work plan, it will probably not be done. If it is in the work plan, but nobody owns it, it still probably will not be done, but now with better formatting. Risk management is described as the essence of project management. Risk is not something to hide until the review meeting, where everyone suddenly becomes theatrical. It must be identified by work package, assessed by impact level, and matched with avoidance or mitigation measures. Gantt charts, milestones, PERT diagrams, and resource histograms support time, dependency, and resource control. In EuroPro, participants learn to build risk registers, define mitigation measures, plan milestones, identify dependencies, and use scheduling tools for decision-making rather than decoration. The skill is proactive control. Participants become able to identify problems before they become crises, adjust plans intelligently, and communicate risks transparently to partners and funders. The impact is better delivery. Projects become less dependent on panic, improvisation, and heroic last-minute rescue operations. Risk is not something to hide until the review meeting, where everyone suddenly becomes theatrical. It is something to manage early, openly, and professionally. The management cockpit links strategy, constraints, objectives, projects, execution, and performance measurement. It uses KPIs, scorecards, and structured information to steer the project. But information alone does not create control. EuroPro teaches how to create a management cockpit, but also that control happens when the project manager uses information to intervene, correct, support, and lead. In this final session, we deal with the hardest part of project and institutional leadership, leading when authority is not know how to solve problems. Many problems in organizations are not technical. The answer is not already known. The difficulty is not merely lack of information. The real challenge may involve learning, values, identity, fear, power, habits, loyalties, loss, and resistance. This is where political systems management meets reality. Adaptive leadership, developed by Ronald Heifetz, Marty Linsky, and Alexander Grashaw, focuses on mobilizing people to face difficult realities and do the work of change. It is not about providing easy answers. It is about creating the conditions in which people can learn, adapt, and act. This is critically important for EU project professionals. EU-funded projects often operate across institutions, sectors, and countries. They introduce innovations, new methods, new policies, new technologies, new partnerships, and new expectations. That means they disturb existing systems. Systems do not always respond with gratitude. In EuroPro, participants learn to diagnose adaptive challenges, regulate tension, map factions, design interventions, hold difficult conversations, and sustain themselves through resistance. The skill is adaptive leadership under complexity to move the system forward. Participants become able to act when the problem is unclear, when stakeholders disagree, and when the system itself must learn and change. The impact is real-world change capacity. Participants can lead projects and reforms that do not merely produce outputs, but shift behaviors, strengthen institutions, and create sustainable impact. Naturally, everyone still asks for a simple solution by Friday. Adaptive leadership explains why Friday may need to be renegotiated. The session begins by dismantling false assumptions. Leadership is not the same as authority. It is not personality. It is not merely power. It is not superior knowledge. It is not the lone hero giving answers. Leadership can be exercised with or without formal authority. It is action that mobilizes people to confront difficult realities. Leadership theory developed from the great man idea through trait theories, behavioral theories, situational and contingency theories, and transformational leadership. The modern conclusion is more useful. Leadership emerges from the interaction between traits, skills, context, followers, learning, and action. We learned what is useful from all previous leadership theories. Inconveniently, this means one cannot simply frame a portrait and declare oneself a leader. Modern leadership is less about command and more about adaptation, service, authenticity, and system learning. Each paradigm matters in EU project environments. Adaptive leadership is essential when projects introduce change and stakeholders resist. Servant leadership matters when teams need trust, support, and development. Authentic leadership matters when credibility, ethics, and transparency are under pressure. Complexity leadership matters when no single actor controls the whole system and innovation depends on networks. In EuroPro, participants learn to use these paradigms as practical lenses. They examine when to direct, when to facilitate, when to support, when to challenge, when to step back, and when to intervene. Participants master a range of leadership tools and how to adapt their behavior to the complexity of the situation and the maturity of the people involved. The impact is better change leadership. Participants can build stronger teams, create trust, support innovation, act with integrity, and enable systems to learn. Great leaders do not simply have all the answers. They create conditions in which better answers can emerge. Less theatrical than pretending to know everything, but considerably more useful. A central distinction is between technical and adaptive challenges. Technical problems have clear definitions and clear solutions, usually handled by authority. Technical adaptive problems are clearer in definition, but require learning. Adaptive challenges are confused, contested, and require the group itself to learn. Many organizations fail because they treat adaptive problems as technical ones, very efficient, very confident, and completely wrong. Adaptive challenges are not all the same. Some are activist challenges, where groups refuse to face an uncomfortable reality. Some are development challenges, where capacity must be built. Some are transition challenges, where values, culture, structures, or identities must change. Some are maintenance challenges, where precious values must be protected during change. Some are creative challenges, where imagination and innovation must be activated. Some are crisis challenges, where anxiety, urgency, and disorder must be managed. Each type requires different leadership work. A capacity problem requires development. A cultural transition requires sense making and negotiation. A crisis requires containment and focus. A creative challenge requires experimentation. A denial problem requires confrontation with reality. In EuroPro, participants learn to classify adaptive challenges and design appropriate interventions. They map symptoms, causes, stakeholders, resistance, losses, loyalties, and possible leverage points. The skill is challenge mapping. Participants become able to understand not only that something is difficult, but why it is difficult and what kind of leadership work it requires. The impact is more precise intervention. Adaptive leadership requires diagnostic humility. First, understand the challenge, then intervene. Adaptive leadership requires movement between action and observation. On the dance floor, we act, we speak, negotiate, intervene, facilitate, decide, and respond. On the balcony, we observe. We look for patterns, factions, loyalties, tensions, avoidance, authority relations, cultural assumptions, and hidden conflicts. The metaphor comes from Heifetz's adaptive leadership work. It is powerful because leaders often get trapped on the dance floor. They become absorbed in events, personalities, pressure, and urgency. When that happens, they lose the pattern. But staying only on the balcony is also a problem. Then leadership becomes academic commentary. Interesting, perhaps, but not very useful to people in the room. In EuroPro, participants practice moving between the two positions. They learn to observe the system, interpret behavior, design interventions, and then return to observation to see what changed. The skill is reflective action. Participants become able to act without becoming blind and observe without becoming detached at all times. The impact is wiser leadership. Participants can identify what is really happening beneath surface behavior, choose better timing, regulate tension, and avoid impulsive reactions. Leadership is not only doing something, it is understanding what you're doing is doing to the system. That sentence is worth remembering. Complex projects involve stakeholders, and stakeholders rarely arrive as one harmonious choir. They come with interests, expectations, loyalties, fears, histories, resources, identities, and interpretations of reality. In ecosystems such as innovation, education, public administration, or EU accession, stakeholders may include ministries, agencies, universities, RDI organizations, businesses, NGOs, municipalities, international organizations, citizens, and EU actors. A faction is not just a group of difficult people. It is a cluster of actors organized around shared interests, identities, incentives, or interpretations. Some factions support change, some resist, some wait to see who wins, some publicly agree and privately obstruct, because apparently human civilization needed that particular management style. In EuroPro, participants learn to map stakeholders and factions. They assess interest, influence, expectations, potential contribution, likely resistance, and possible negative effects. The skill is political and ecosystem diagnosis. Participants become able to understand where support can be built, where resistance may emerge, and which actors must be engaged early. The impact is better reform and project leadership. Participants can design more realistic stakeholder strategies, build coalitions, create and control conflict, and avoid assuming that everyone is aligned because a strategy document says so. Stakeholder engagement is not sending one email and calling it consultation. It is the disciplined work of understanding people, interests, and power. Adaptive leadership requires a holding environment. A holding environment is a space where difficult work can happen without the system collapsing. The leader must regulate the temperature, maintain focus, identify the real work, give responsibility back to the people who must learn, and orchestrate conflict productively. Too little tension produces avoidance. Too much tension produces breakdown. The leadership task is not to make everyone comfortable. It is to keep discomfort productive. This is difficult because adaptive leadership is dangerous. Leaders may be marginalized, attacked, seduced into feeling special, distracted by endless operational demands, or pushed into solving problems that others must own. Heifetz and Linsky describe these dangers clearly. When leaders ask systems to change, systems often respond by neutralizing the source of discomfort. They may blame, flatter, isolate, overload, or attack the person raising the issue. In EuroPro, participants learn how to manage these dangers. They practice regulating tension, keeping attention on the work, distinguishing role from self, and giving responsibility back without abandoning the group. The skill is holding steady under pressure. The impact is sustainable change leadership. Participants become able to lead difficult conversations, manage resistance, and keep people engaged with uncomfortable but necessary work. Systems do not always applaud those who ask them to change. Sometimes they prefer to shoot the messenger, then form a working group to discuss why messages are not improving. Adaptive leadership requires resilience. This is not the inspirational poster version of resilience, where everyone smiles bravely at a mountain. This is practical resilience, the capacity to stay purposeful, disciplined, and connected while working inside pressure, conflict, and uncertainty. The survival toolkit includes holding steady, focusing on the work, managing personal hungers, separating role from self, using oneself as data, building alliances, relying on confidants, and protecting sanctuary. Managing personal hungers is important. Leaders may hunger for approval, control, importance, certainty, or rescue. These hungers can distort judgment. Separating role from self is equally important. If every criticism of your intervention becomes a wound to your identity, the system will control you very quickly. In EuroPro, participants learn resilience as a professional discipline. They examine their own reactions, identify support systems, develop practices for reflection, and learn how to remain effective without becoming the first casualty of their own ambition. The skill is sustainable leadership. Participants become able to stay in the work long enough for adaptation to happen. The impact is leadership longevity and real institutional change. Participants can support teams, manage conflict, survive resistance, and continue advancing purpose without burning out. Adaptive leadership is not heroic exhaustion, it is disciplined endurance. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and you cannot lead adaptive change if you collapse before the system begins to learn. Thank you for following this introduction to EuroPro, Master in EU Funding and Project Leadership. What you have seen here is only a structured overview. The live program goes much deeper. We work with real EU funding instruments, real call texts, real proposal logic, real consortium positioning, real project management tools, and real leadership challenges. EuroPro is designed for professionals who want to develop serious competence in EU funding and project leadership. It is for people who want to understand how EU policy becomes funding, how calls become proposals, how proposals become projects, and how projects create measurable impact. Participants develop practical skills, identifying opportunities, analyzing calls, mapping stakeholders, positioning organizations, designing proposals, using AI responsibly, structuring work packages, managing risks, leading teams, and navigating complexity. The real value is not only knowledge. Knowledge is useful, of course, but knowledge alone can still sit politely in a notebook. EuroPro is about applied capability, the ability to act, design, lead, manage, influence, and deliver. For professionals who want to advance their EU funding expertise, strengthen institutional capacity, and lead projects that create real-world impact, EuroPro offers a practical and strategic learning path. Advance your EU funding expertise, lead stronger projects, create greater impact, and preferably, let us do it with more evidence, better strategy, and fewer myths about easy EU money.